Hello and welcome to the True Hearted Trainer podcast with me, Dr. Lisa. I'm your host. I'm a veterinarian and a Delta accredited professional dog trainer. Welcome to episode 2, Change the Language and Change the Experience. Now, I'd like to welcome you to the podcast with a thought, and this thought is from the Educated Dog Learning Centre, and it is simply this: thinking of your dog as behaving badly predisposes you to think of punishment. Thinking of your dog as struggling to handle something difficult encourages you to help them through their distress. Now, as a dog trainer, I've paid a lot of attention to the kind of language that dog trainers in the industry are using, and in my opinion, I think that we can do a lot better. There are some terms that I would like to see put to the side, and this is because they have wider repercussions with respect to the other environments that the language spills into inevitably. And firstly, the general public and the dog-owning public, and some of the language that trainers use, that I've heard trainers use, actually help to shape people's opinions of their dog and how they see their dog. And sometimes these opinions can actually set the owner up against their dog and see it as who can control the other because my dog is trying to control me. So, and some of the language that we're using as dog trainers also helps to perpetuate myths like dominance, and this has really, really bad effects on the mental health and mental well-being of dogs when we have myths like this being perpetuated. So, in my opinion, the language we use sets the tone. It also sets the framework for our training and our intentions when we're training with our dogs. And I'd like to go through some examples of some widely used terms in the training industry. Let's start with dominance because it's one of the most controversial ones. I'm still not sure why, because there's endless evidence to support the flaws, and actually that outlines the flaws in dominance theory. But anyway, dominance, so controlling, prevailing or powerful position, especially in a social hierarchy. Other meanings refer to power and influence over others. Some synonyms for dominance are supremacy, superiority, authority, rule, command, control. So once again, look, we can see where this type of language is taking us, and it's taking us towards a pathway to punishment. And in the links in the description below, you'll find a link to welfare in dog training, and this outlines why we shouldn't be using dominance when we're talking about dog training and dogs in general. And there's another link from the Australian Veterinary Association that debunks dominance very nicely. So please take a look at those. Now, I just want to continue with a couple more terms. So command is another term that's regularly used, and it basically means to give an authoritative or peremptory order, or to dominate from a strategic position from a superior height. And it's also defined as the ability to use or control something. So once again, we have our dogs, the opinion that we're sort of creating of our dogs is that we need to control them because they're, for whatever reasons, they're trying to climb up the social hierarchy and dominate us, which is, just not true. So I like to use terms like request. So, for example, request just means to politely or formally ask for something, or an act of asking politely or formally for something. So I'd probably ask you which you would prefer to be given. Would you prefer to be given a command or a request? Now, it's pretty obvious which one I would prefer. And the most important thing that I want to sort of point out with this sort of language is that if we use the word command, then it certainly has implications for the one that isn't obeying that command. Now, another term that's used very widely, and I hear this every single day, and it's the word correction. And basically, we can define that as an amendment or rectification. But the second definition is a rebuke or punishment. And there is another definition that is a neutralisation or counteraction, or bringing into conformity with a standard, something substituted in place of what's wrong. And number 5, which I've included for completeness, is the treatment and rehabilitation of offenders through a program involving penal custody, parole and probation. Okay, so that's out of context for dog training. But then again, I would say, is it out of context for dog training? Because if we are looking at our dogs from a position where we're wanting to command them and correct them and have them obey us, then we're obviously looking at them as offending in some way, being wrong. And I really think we need to reflect on the language that we as dog trainers are using, and really reflect on the wider repercussions of the language that we're using when we're thinking about how the general public and dog owners are forming opinions of their dogs and setting their dogs up in the training contexts into a pathway to use punishment. Now, the last, and we've got a couple here. So obedience is another term. Compliance with an order, request, so that's nice that the word request is in there, or law or submission to another's authority. So we're still talking about submitting, controlling, and I don't think these sorts of terms and this sort of language is appropriate in dog training, because it really doesn't help dog owners to view training as a partnership. It basically has owners viewing training as a dictatorship, and in my opinion, it isn't. It's a partnership. It's not a dictatorship, and that's the way I like to think about it. Now, the last term is redirect, and that simply means to change the course or the direction of something. And I like to use redirection, I like to use guidance, I like to use requests when I'm training dogs, and I think that this shapes my intentions, and it also helps me to set my dog up for success, because if I'm guiding, then that means I'm assisting and I'm helping. I'm not trying to control, I'm not trying to rebuke, and I'm not trying to punish. So it sets me on the pathway to positive reinforcement. Now, the other thing that these types of terms, correction, command, obedience, these types of terms, the tone of the language has clear implications, of course, for the one that doesn't obey, but it does lead to the punishment, and most importantly, this language effectively shifts the blame automatically onto the dog, and it relinquishes any responsibility on the part of the human for their contribution to the dog's misbehaviour. And I've put misbehaviour in inverted in commas or in quotations, because we are training our dogs every second that we're with them, whether we are aware of it or not. And quite oftentimes we are reinforcing the very behaviours that we don't find desirable. So, we can't blame our dogs for our own deficiencies when we're talking about a training context. And it's no excuse for us to then go down to the pathway of punishment when we're using this type of language. Now, there's a link in the description. It's a video link, and the video is called The Greatest Lie Told to Dog Owners. Now, it's an interesting video. If you haven't seen episode 1 of the True How to Train a Dog podcast, it might be an idea to check that out, and because this links into that in some respects. Now, it links into it in that it's an interesting video because I cannot see any qualifications listed for the person that's doing the video. But more interestingly, they have the word university in their logo. And I listened very carefully to the language, and the language sets up without a doubt the intentions of this person with respect to how they approach dog training. Now, they approach dog training very differently to the way that I approach it. They approach it in the way that I was just outlining here, with examples using terms like dominance, command, correction, obedience, these sorts of things. And if you are able to watch the video all the way through, you'll be able to clearly see that the intentions of this person is to use punishment when he's training dogs. And the example that he gave an example of training with a prong collar. Now, he calls it a pinch collar. Let me say that they don't pinch, they puncture. And there's a photo in the description below to outline the very trauma that these sorts of things cause dogs. And once again, there's no discussion from the dog's point of view with respect to the body language. Now, he's training an aggressive dog, and I suspect that because this dog is a shelter dog, a dog that's been surrendered to a shelter, that there is a lot of complex issues going on with this poor dog, and it's very likely that this dog has an underlying fear and anxiety. And what this person has done, this trainer, he has automatically put this dog into a situation where there's going to be conflict and distress for this dog. That's going to engage the primitive part of this dog's brain, engage the fight or flight area of the brain, and of course the dog ran to the end of the leash, and I think it may have been a number of metres, the leash. The dog got to the end of the leash, the prong collar then dug in, and this animal was in pain. Now, this person acknowledges that, yes, the dog's in pain, and that the dog learnt that when he was away from him, he was in pain, and when he approached him, when he walked back to him, he wasn't going to be in pain, and he got a treat for it. Now, I can say right now that the last thing the dog's going to remember is getting a treat off this guy. The first thing he's going to remember is the awful pain that's around his neck, being associated with the prong collar. And what is even more worrying is that the language that this person is using has set him specifically and basically uncompromisingly on a pathway to punishment, and that is what this poor dog endured. Now, systematic punishment in this sort of respect is not a science, and it has no relation to the scientific basis for how dogs learn. Now, this is really worrying because me watching this, red flags are going off everywhere, no understanding of the basic scientific principles of learning theory. But this isn't an isolated case, and I've said this before in episode 1. This is happening across the world every single day. When we consider rescue dogs or dogs that have been surrendered to shelters, the very reason for many, many of these dogs to be surrendered in the first place lies in the behaviour issues that they were surrendered for. So these are the reasons that the dogs have been surrendered for in the first place. These issues aren't being addressed, and instead punishment is being used and espoused as an appropriate and scientific training technique in these cases. Now, the emotional state of these dogs, these fearful dogs, these dogs that have underlying anxieties, training alone isn't going to be adequate for any of these dogs. And in the case of these dogs, in this video example, they need qualified specialist behavioural advice from a registered veterinary specialist or a veterinary behaviourist. And I did have a look at some of the other videos, and the canine body language that I did see in the other videos were stressed, fearful, frustrated and confused dogs, and it's very heartbreaking when you see that sort of thing. Now, and when we consider the spectrum of normal and usual canine body language in socially well-adjusted, confident dogs, they will actually give us a number of signs before they resort to a demonstration of aggressive behaviour, such as a growl or, a snarl or something like that. So for dogs to be automatically going to, reacting in a way where they're lunging and growling and being very, very aggressive in their response, we're dealing with a very traumatised dog, and they need to be treated with kid gloves, and they need a specialist approach. Now, I just want to remind you again, we have systematic cruelty and punishment of dogs. And I want to remind you again that pinch collars don't pinch, they puncture. And please just have a look at that photo again that's in the link, just to remind you of how much damage that they do on very delicate necks. Thankfully, prong collars are illegal in Queensland, shock collars are not. So that's very sad as well. So the point of the video is to understand the implications for dogs when we're using language like command, dominance, correction, obedience. When these sorts of terms, this sort of language is being used, we need to understand the real threatening implications for our dogs of what this language is doing to them in the context of dog training, and call it out for exactly what it is. Because it illustrates the intentions that, this type of language leads us down the pathway to punishment, I really would want to say that the greatest untold truth that every dog owner should know is that language where we're using command, obedience, dominance and correction does only serve to pave the way for punishment. So I'd really like you to ask yourself, how can you expect your dog to learn if you're unwilling to step up and truly teach? So I think that gives us a lot of food for thought there. And please take a look at the links in the description, and feel free to like, share and subscribe this video. This is an emotional subject, because we're considering that punishment. When we're considering punishment, it has such a long-lasting effect on animals and on our dogs, and we do really need to call it out for what it is. It's not scientific. It is not aligned with the theory of how dogs learn, and there's no place for punishment in training. So I'd like to close the podcast today with just a recap, just to have a look in the links in the description. Feel free to like, share and subscribe, and follow me on Instagram. I'm at The True Hearted Trainer. You can also find me on Facebook at Contact VCABs. If you type that into your browser, at Contact VCABs, you'll see the Veterinary and Companion Animal Behaviour Service Facebook page, and you can also check out our website, which is www.vcabs.com.au. All right, well, I'm going to leave it here for episode 2, Change the Language to Change the Experience. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'm Dr. Lisa. Thanks for joining me, and remember, stay positive.